Few living Oregonians can say they played a role in shaping one of the crown jewels of our state, enjoyed by millions of people each year. Stan Hinatsu is one of those Oregonians. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, travel and outdoors reporter and co-host of the Peak Northwest podcast, Jamie Hale, is here, and we're going to talk about his profile about Stan, talk about the Columbia River Gorge, and so much more. Jamie, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Jamie, I really enjoyed your story. It's always great to read about interesting and influential people that we don't know about. That's one of the beauties of journalism and the type of access we get. So I just want to step back before this story a bit. And how did you first meet Stan, and why did you want to tell his story?
Well, Stan has been a source of mine, for about the last 7 years or so, since around the time I started working on the outdoors and travel beat. Stan has always been sort of the recreation guy in the gorge, the recreation guy for the U.S. Forest Service. And he was always just sort of the person to talk to about closed trails or bridge repairs or whatever's going on in recreation areas in the gorge. So he was always just the kind of the guy I talked to, and he had just this wealth of knowledge and was just such a good source, from a professional standpoint. He always was sort of that guy willing to talk to the press and, willing to go beyond just sort of like non-committal answers.
Now, I, as a former reporter, know what makes a good source, but obviously access is important, but maybe some listeners might not know. I mean, when you're talking to someone for that long, obviously what did you enjoy about talking to him, and what made him a good source?
Well, he was, I think, just always willing to talk was the thing. If, for example, if I'm going to ask someone from a government agency about a closed trail, they can really easily say, look, we don't know when it's going to reopen. And that's right. Totally fair. But what Stan would do is he would say something like, well, we're really hoping to reopen it in the spring, but it looks like there might be some wet weather coming in February. So that might push it back to June. It's basically saying the same thing as I don't know when the trail is going to reopen, but it's giving information that I can then put in the story. It's giving people like actual details. And that's like a really small thing that Stan understood that people need and that people want.
Absolutely. And like you said, as a reporter, that's great because you want to give people good information, and he was willing and able to give it.
Exactly. And this is kind of what I've heard from the way that he's worked with other people in the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, as that area is known, is that he was sort of the guy willing to listen, willing to talk, willing to have conversations, and sort of just get into the muck of it.
So it's not every day that you decide to go deep and write an interesting profile on a source, but obviously there's a moment that made sense to write it, and he has an interesting life story too. So could you just tell us about Stan Hinatsu and his story and his upbringing?
Yeah, well, so Stan retired at the end of 2022 after working 31 years for the Forest Service in the Gorge, which is a really long time for anyone working one position, let alone someone in, an agency like the U.S. Forest Service. But Stan was kind of like, he's one of these guys who spent most of his life in this area. So Stan is a third generation Oregonian. He's from the Portland area. His grandparents immigrated here from Japan on both sides, and his dad's side, they were sharecroppers in the Portland area. His mom's side, they grew flowers and greenhouses in Milwaukee, just south of Portland. And so Stan grew up with the two of them and this great influence. Of course, being of Japanese descent in that time period was not always easy. Both of his parents' families were taken to the Minidoka prison camp during World War II out in Idaho. Yeah. And his dad's family, went back to Ontario, did some farming there. His mom's family actually went back to their same farm in Milwaukee because their neighbors had kept up the land for them, which was pretty rare in that time.
Yeah.
Really cool experience. But they eventually met in Portland again and raised Stan and his three sisters in the Portland area. It was a pretty cool upbringing. His dad worked as an illustrator for Meyer and Frank, drawing pictures at first and then taking pictures. His mom was a PE teacher at a high school in Portland. And so they kind of grew up, doing the Portland lifestyle, but also going out into nature like a lot of families here do. So they loved the gorge, obviously. So Stan talked about having these, memories being a child of biking up to Vista House or, hiking through Oneonta Gorge or picnicking in Eagle Creek, all the stuff that we do today still, he said, just with far fewer crowds, obviously. So when he was thinking about, as a kid, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? He would always watch Lassie, he said, and just imagined himself like being on a horse with his dog out in the wilderness. And he thought, I want to help people do what I like to do. I want to help people, get out and enjoy the woods and the rivers and the mountains like I do.
That's a great visual. I can see him from the images in your story, which we'll share in the episode notes. But frolicking through the fields with a dog and a horse, I mean, that does not get much better than that. So, a lot of people have those dreams, but he turned this into a career. What was his career path like? How did he go from growing up in the Portland area to the position that he ultimately retired in?
Well, so he started as a Forest Service intern while he was in college still at OSU studying forestry. So he still started up in the Wenatchee National Forest. And he was doing, firefighting, just real basic stuff. Back then, this is in the 1970s, the Forest Service was still largely all about timber. So he was doing a lot of work, understanding how to work with the timber industry, assessing timber stands, fighting fires ostensibly to protect those, natural resources, doing a lot of that kind of stuff. He had, talked to his peers about wanting to do recreation. They said, that's not really kind of the focus right now. So get your feet wet doing timber, keep coming back, doing these internships, and you'll get there eventually, maybe. So that's what he did. He, after college, he went back to Wenatchee and he started doing timber work for the Forest Service. But in 1991, he got a really nice job offer at the really newly created Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, which had just been created in 1986. This is a pretty interesting designation. So unlike a national forest, unlike a national forest, which is just like a U.S. Forest Service managed area, this National Scenic Area was like this patchwork of agencies. So in the gorge on either side of the river, you have Washington State Parks, Oregon State Parks, county parks, Oregon Department of Transportation lands, and U.S. Army Corps of Engineer lands. And you have, of course, U.S. Forest Service lands. All of these different agencies manage this. And in 1986, they decided to bring them all together under one sort of unified agency with the goal of preserving, protecting these lands for their environmental purposes and also as a recreation area. This was, I think, something that people see today and they think it's a really great treasure that we have. But when it first opened, it was not super popular, at least not among everybody. So this was something where a lot of locals in the gorge said, the federal government's coming in, telling us what we can and can't do with our land. People who wanted to develop neighborhoods or build retirement homes are suddenly told they can't do that anymore. They have to go through certain regulations in order to do that. And it was pretty contentious. So Stan, having moved from this contentious job managing timberlands with the Forest Service, now moved into this contentious position of managing all of this conflict with the Forest Service in the gorge. And he was kind of like the perfect person to do it. I think having cut his teeth on those conflicts, he knew and maybe just had this innate skill of talking to people and working with people who, had all of these different ideas of what the right thing to do was, and knowing just sort of how to soothe over those different tensions.
Yeah, that was one of the things that came out of your reporting that was interesting is, it's not often that you're going to, it depends on the area, right? But Forest Service and environmental advocates or people who are really fiercely devoted to a certain issue. It's not unusual for them to clash, right? But people had good things to say about Stan and how he managed this area.
Yeah, so as we kind of move forward through the decades, he becomes the the Forest Service go-to guy for a lot of these talks. So you end up in these big, big meeting table conversations with all these agencies, not just the agencies, but like advocacy groups and, local governments and, individuals who have vested interests in this area. Stan is sort of like the Forest Service go-to person to arrange and manage all of this. And it becomes a really important job there because the Forest Service, of course, just one partner in the scenic area, but it is what everyone was sort of telling me, pretty much the biggest partner in the scenic area. They do manage a lot of land there. They are kind of like the primary source when it comes to managing recreation areas. So Stan's not only doing all these meetings, he's also, dealing with wildfires and they break out in the gorge, or landslides, or bridges that, break, or, any number of trail closures, managing crowds, all of these things. He's just juggling 1,000 different things. When I saw him, I went to go interview him on his last couple of weeks on the job. He had a to-do list that I kid you not was like 60 items long. I don't know if there's a second page because it was top to bottom on the page. And that was just the day's to-do list. It was just like Tuesday, here's all these things to do. And he's just one of these people who can manage all of that. It's very impressive. And everyone who I spoke to was just, I think, had nothing but good things to say about Stan. And I think I got this impression that everyone was just really impressed with how he's been able to do this job.
So the land itself, I mean, have there been new trails that have popped up during his time? I mean, are they blazing trails during the last few decades, or has it kind of been just managing and improving on the existing network that was already there?
Yeah, well, that was one of the things he told me. He said in the time he came on in the early 90s, most national forests were taking an active stance at not creating new trails. They wanted to kind of slow things down a little bit. But in the Columbia River Gorge, it was the exact opposite. They're saying we want to acquire new land. We want to build new trails. We want to give people more opportunities to get out in this area. So they're not all just crowded into, say, Eagle Creek, Multnomah Falls, whatever. Since that time, they've been really actively invested in finding ways to spread people out because a lot of people like to go to the gorge. Yeah. So Stan oversaw a lot of acquisition of some of these wildflower areas we know now. So places like Memaloose or Coyote Wall, these are places that he helped the Forest Service acquire and then build new trails on. So places that are sort of now like classic spring wildflower destinations are actually pretty new. And he's been around long enough where he can say he's had the kind of impact to help create those places.
That's pretty special. Have you been out in the woods with Stan before?
We haven't just gone casually hiking or anything. I think I've been out, when there's a news conference on a fire or a bridge repair or something like that. That sort of thing. But he definitely is the kind of person who likes to get out there. He told me he doesn't do a lot of, hunting or fishing anymore, but he loves to get out there and hike. He likes to be out in nature. He likes to take his kids out in nature as well. He has, after growing up with 3 sisters, he has 3 daughters himself. So,
oh, wow. That's nice. Does he have a favorite spot or favorite go-to spots that he talked about in terms of places in the gorge?
I tried to ask him that, and I think a lot of people, people ask me this too, and it's impossible to say here's my favorite spot or here's a go-to spot. And I think Stan's probably about the same thought. So, it's hard because there's so many really amazing, beautiful places. When people ask me, where should I go in the gorge? It's well, do you want to see waterfalls? Mm-hmm. Do you want to see big views of the river? Do you want to hike a bunch? Do you want to, not hike? There's really just so much there that it's impossible to, I think, pick just one or two.
Obviously, the area has changed a lot in the last couple decades during his time there. I mean, you've kind of alluded to it. The population has grown. Hood River and Stevenson are, destinations on both sides of the river. How has that complicated his job?
It's just, I think, more obstacles, more challenges. He talked a lot about the increase in visitors between 2006 and 2016, where, like you said, the Portland metropolitan area, the population just swelled. and, the rise of social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram in that time period. Campaigns like Travel Oregon's 7 Wonders of Oregon, which mentioned the gorge in there. All of these things contributed to this huge number of people coming out. And that meant trying to figure out how to manage these crowds. So all of a sudden, Stan and a lot of people in the National Scenic Area are looking at ways to mitigate not just like overcrowding, but how can we help protect these natural environments as well. So that's where we saw things like, an investment in public transportation to places like Dog Mountain, to places like Multnomah Falls, where you saw, timed entry permit systems for Multnomah Falls, and last year for the historic Columbia River Highway, just kind of constantly looking for ways to help mitigate the crowds or deal with any obstacles that might come forward.
Yeah, that kind of stuff I would imagine would have been unimaginable when he first arrived here in this gig 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's changed a lot. But I think that's kind of the nature of the gorge in itself. And people have this idea. This is something that Stan said, that people have this idea of forests as static places, but they're actually these really constantly changing ecosystems. And the Columbia River Gorge as a whole is like that too. I mean, it looks totally different today than it looked 60 years ago, but it looked totally different 100 years ago than it did 60 years ago. I mean, we used to have Celilo Falls on the Columbia River, and that was one of the biggest waterfalls in the world. And today it's underwater. Even before that, the lava flows, the earthquakes, the landslides always have shaped this land. And, so it's a place that is constantly changing. And if you're someone who really thrives in that environment of constantly facing new challenges, like it seems Stan does, then it's a really great place to work and, stake out a career.
Staying with that same mindset, I guess, it makes sense then that when the Eagle Creek fire came through and, was pretty emotional and devastating in the moment, but he didn't have maybe the same reaction that some people who just like to go out there and, on a weekend multiple times a year had, right? He viewed it through the same prism that you just described.
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting. Stan said he was taken aback by how emotional the response was. That to me was very normal and natural because I had a similar emotional response myself, but he's a forester, right? He's like, well, I was expecting it to burn at some point. And here it is. But he said, that hearing that emotional outpouring was really sort of a learning moment for him. He had always kind of assumed people came out to the gorge just because it's convenient, or because like there's a lot of places to hike. And he said, seeing that showed me that people come out here because this place means something to them. Like there's a deeper connection there. And that's true. I think, people have this really personal, emotional, and spiritual connection with the Columbia Gorge, truly always have. And so, to be in charge of that, it was interesting to me thinking of Stan being in this position. Yeah. And obviously he's not singular, right? He's one part of a lot of people in charge of this area, but in a way he's sort of like, for those who view it as a spiritual area, he's sort of like a monk overseeing this temple, right? He's someone who is there to protect and keep it up and make sure people can continue to go there. So it's a really important role for people who really care about the gorge.
To stay with that kind of philosophical bent, Jamie, I mean, what does his story and his career experience say about all of our experiences, I guess, as we approach the outdoors?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of magnetic, isn't it? I think people are drawn towards these beautiful outdoor spaces. The fact that people can go hiking anywhere in this incredible region and people continue to come back to the gorge really says something about that place and about, I think, maybe our desire to create relationships with places. When we develop this relationship with the land, we, I think, can really get kind of sucked in and focused on particular places in particular, just like we might have really good friends, we might have really good relationships with our family. And Stan seemed to really get sucked in here to the Columbia River Gorge. And people talk about, 31 years working in one place with the Forest Service. I talked to other Forest Service people. They're like, people move around constantly in this agency. it's almost unheard of to hear someone spending, most or all of their career in one place. They're always moving around. So there was something about this place that drew Stan in, and something about the way that he worked here that kept him in that place. And it's really impressive, and I think really telling of the gorge in general.
So, where does he go from here? Off into retirement, I guess. What does that look like for someone who's been in the action and had the, 60 different action items on a day? That's a big change.
Yeah, I asked him about this, and he said, it's going to be a slow ease out. He's still going to kind of be on hand to help out with the transition, doing some work every now and then. But then he said he might do, some volunteer work here and there. Might just kind of be around. It doesn't sound like Stan's going to be gone. He's not just going to like hoof it to Florida or something. Although who knows, maybe he'll change his mind and he'll want to do that. But it sounds like there is something still where he feels drawn to stay here and drawn to continue doing work in some capacity, at least for a little while.
Well, I think it's just fascinating to learn. This is someone obviously I was not talking to on a frequent basis like you were, and to see kind of the influence he had, I think is going to change how I, what I'm thinking about next time I'm out, whether it's on the Eagle Creek or other spots on the gorge. I might think of Stan a little bit when I'm out there.
Yeah, and all the people who do work on this in the gorge, on these trails. Trails are designed to look like they're just the easiest things, like they just came out of the ground. But so much work goes into it, so much effort, so much collaboration. And Stan is, I think, such a great example of that kind of collaboration. Yeah,
and if I ever do Mount Defiance again, I can curse his name as I go up that wretched trail. Man, I'm sore just thinking about it. Well, is there anything else about Stan in particular, or kind of this overall topic that you'd want to hit on? It's really a great story about an interesting guy.
Yeah, I think what I kept hearing from people was just the way that he talked to people, the way he treated people. And this is, I think, such a great example for anybody, especially people who work with other people. He had this way of this way of grace of talking to people where, even if people are having these ideas that he doesn't agree with, or they're trying to, bristle at him or anything like that, he listens. He's willing to hear people out. He's willing to do, work on their behalf. He's willing to try to do what he can to help people out. And I think there's this sort of this non-attachment there that's really impressive, that I think can be inspiring, to not get angry, not get upset, not shut down, but to just open yourself up and listen. That's, a really hard thing to do, but for folks like Stan who can do that, it's such a benefit to everyone around them.
Well said. Well, Jamie, thank you for the story and for coming on the show to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you haven't read the story already, I'll share a link in the episode notes. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts, or tell a friend. Also, check out Peak Northwest, which Jamie has been doing since 2019, anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.